Well, good morning, friends. Crystal here from Homemaking on the Homestead. And today I have another 5-day menu plan for you. Extremely frugal, cooking from scratch, and I think you're going to like it. This menu plan is going to use 1 whole chicken and 1 pound of hamburger, and it's going to make 5 different meals. And I am going to say that this is cooking for 2 because I made this for my husband and I, and we ended up eating this for 9 or kind of 10 days actually, and it worked out perfect. So it was able to stretch, even though I have done my best to take my old tried and true recipes that I used when I was feeding my large family of 8 children, the 10 of us. I scaled them way down so that they would be, that 2 people could easily get through them. But they still ended up lasting us for more than just 1 meal. If you don't like to eat leftovers, then just take what is left after the first meal and put it in the freezer. And then in another week or so, you can pull it out and do the same thing all over again. Or just have extra meals sitting and waiting in your freezer. How great would that be? If you haven't seen my first 5-day menu plan, then I will link that right up here for you, and I will link it in the description box. And just like in that video, I am going to take foods and do some preparing of things for the following meal, and use things like the chicken for 3 meals, and the pound of hamburger goes for another 2 meals. So I'm going to show you how you can do preps ahead of time, and that will save you steps and help to prevent waste as well. I like to make my meals as efficient as possible. So the first one that I'm going to show you here is Italian chicken and potatoes. I started out with 1 whole chicken that weighed about 5 to 5.5 pounds. You could also use chicken leg quarters or something like that, but you'll want that bigger weight of a chicken so that it can be used for the different meals. So I seasoned my chicken with some Italian dressing seasoning. This Italian seasoning dressing mix that I will be using is something that I make on my own. And I will have this recipe along with all the other recipes in the description box below. This is typically used to make salad dressing, like a Good Seasons Italian salad dressing pack. And it makes great Italian salad dressing, but it also works great as a seasoning. So I liberally sprinkled this seasoning all over my chicken and kind of set that aside to soak in those flavors while I then went to work on my potatoes. I washed 6 potatoes for this. I am going to be using 3 of them in tonight's dinner, and the other 3 are going to be baked right next to my Dutch oven while my chicken is roasting, and they will be used in tomorrow night's dinner. I also washed a few carrots as well. For the first 3 potatoes, I took them and cut them into wedges, and then I poked the other 3 with a knife so that I could bake them. And with the carrots, I cut those into chunks to be cooked tonight with the potatoes. I layered my potato wedges at the bottom of my Dutch oven. If you don't have a Dutch oven, you can use a baking dish, and you'll just want to cover everything really well with foil. But I layered those at the bottom of my Dutch oven, and I sprinkled them with more of that Italian seasoning mix. And then I topped the carrots on top of that, and then took my chicken and set that on top of everything else. I covered that and popped it into the oven to bake for about an hour with the lid on, and then you bake it for a period of time with the lid off, so that when you're done you have a beautiful roasted chicken. Those potatoes and carrots were absolutely delicious because they soaked up all of those juices from the chicken as the chicken was roasting. So we had that along with the salad for dinner for that night. On the second night, I made chicken potato soup. I still had quite a bit of the chicken left over, and I removed that from the bones and separated it so that I could use the bones to make stock, and the chicken meat I cut up and divided that in half to be used in 2 different meals. I put the bones into my Instant Pot and got that going. I usually do it for about an hour. I cook it for about an hour. If you don't have an Instant Pot, you could do it in a crock pot, you could do it on the stove pot. But the Instant Pot certainly does make the process go a whole lot faster and make some absolutely delicious tasting broth. So I highly recommend that, but you do what you have, using what you have and what works for you. Since it could be a few days before I finally get to the second chicken meal, I went ahead and put that in the freezer just to keep it fresh, because I am not planning on making the second chicken meal towards the end of this menu plan. To start making this soup, I chopped up 1 small onion and a rib of celery, and I had about 3 mushrooms that I pulled out. You can use any vegetables that you want, but those are some of my favorite vegetables, so I added those. I also had some mini sweet peppers that I added, chopped up too. I then put those into a pot that I had heated my oil up in. While those vegetables were cooking and sauteing, I pulled out the 3 potatoes that I had baked in the oven the night before, and I also had a few leftover potatoes and carrots, and I cut all of those up into bite-sized pieces. After adding the potatoes, I added 2 cups of the broth that I had made, and I seasoned it well, added some frozen corn to that, and then put the lid on so that that could simmer for a little while. After that had simmered for about 10 or 15 minutes, I went ahead and added the chicken to that and 2 cups of milk. I used whole milk and kind of stirred that up and let the flavors blend for a little bit, and that was it. I then took the other 4 cups of broth and put that aside for another meal. Now I want to share with you what I call my winter salad. If you want the most frugal vegetables to buy during this time of the year, it is definitely cabbage, carrots, and kale. And I just chop up all of these vegetables, grate up the carrots, and I put them into one big salad. And it is frugal. It'll last for a long time because those vegetables do not go bad quickly at all. So it's one of my favorite winter salads to make. I went ahead and served this with a pumpkin muffins that I had made previously and had put in the freezer. And we really enjoyed this meal. We ate that meal for 2 nights. My next meal is an easy hamburger noodle 1-pot dinner. I started by cooking up my hamburger and adding an onion to that, seasoning it really well, and then I divided it in half to save the other half for another meal. To what I had left in the pot, I added a can of diced tomatoes and my seasonings, and then I put in my noodles. Now at this point you don't want to stir anything, you just want to let those noodles sit on top. I then added 2 cups of chicken broth, not the chicken broth that I had saved. I ended up using my Better Than Bouillon chicken broth, and I put the lid on and let that cook for about 20 to 30 minutes. While that was simmering, I went ahead and put some frozen green beans on a tray and put those in the oven to serve roasted green beans with this dinner. Once my noodles were nice and soft and had absorbed most of the liquid, I actually put it back on and let it simmer just a little bit longer to just absorb any extra liquid. By that time my green beans were done, and then I put in about 1 cup of sour cream. So this really makes this dish taste so good to add that, and if you have leftover sour cream, don't worry, we're going to be using that in another meal. The very last thing I did, which was totally optional, is I sprinkled a little cheddar cheese on the top. I have made this meal many times and skipped that part, but it does add a nice little flavor touch to everything. This was absolutely delicious, and I served it alongside with my roasted green beans. This next meal is a delicious hamburger cabbage soup. I started out by cutting up 1 carrot, some mushrooms, and using that cabbage again, I cut off a chunk of that and ended up slicing that all up. You need about 6 to 8 cups of cabbage, which may seem like a lot, but cabbage ends up cooking down quite a bit. In my soup pot, I heated up some oil and put in my vegetables and cooked that until the mushrooms had cooked. I added in the other half of the hamburger that I had saved from the night before. I then added in my diced tomatoes, my seasonings, and a 1/4 cup of white rice. Now is when I used my 4 cups of broth that I had saved, and it was nice and gelled because it was cold, but it obviously, when it warms up, it thins out. I put the lid on that and let it come to a boil, and then I put my cabbage all over the top of that and turn the heat down and just let that simmer for a little bit. After about 10-15 minutes, I stirred it up, but I wanted this cabbage cooked very well, so I continued on with that. Now I'm going to show you an absolutely amazing recipe. We loved this so much. This is an Italian quick bread, an Italian cheesy quick bread, and it reminds me of Irish soda bread, but maybe with an Italian flair to it. The batter comes together really good. It's kind of pasty and chunky, but you just pour that into, or spoon that into your loaf pan, and you need to bake it for about an hour. I do have the link to this recipe down below. At this point, my cabbage soup was looking better, and I just continued to stir it and turn the heat down and let that simmer just a little bit longer. Then I decided it was time to figure out dessert, and I wanted to make brownies, but I was all out of my brownie mix. So the first thing I did was start by making my brownie mix, which is a bulk mix, and then from that I made a single batch of brownies for our dessert that night. I have shared this in a previous video on bulk mixes for your pantry, and I will link that up here for you so that you can go check that out and even more of my mixes, although I do have the mix recipe in the description box below. By that time it was time to pull out my bread, and isn't that the most gorgeous thing you've ever seen? And not only did it look amazing, but it tasted absolutely delicious. I ended up toasting it and spreading it with a little bit of butter to serve right alongside our dinner that night. This bread just had so much flavor to it. It was amazing. Of course, by that time my soup is completely done, and that was dinner. We were ready to serve that up. I had that, and I had made a tossed green salad to go with that. Now for my last meal. It is white bean chicken chili. This recipe has always been a family favorite. I started out by cooking 1 cup of white beans in my Instant Pot. Of course, you can do it on the stovetop again if you don't have an Instant Pot, but it goes a lot faster if you do. It takes about 45 minutes to cook the beans. While the beans were cooking, I chopped up an onion and another rib of celery. I heated some oil in my soup pot and added those vegetables to let them get nice and soft. By that time, my beans were done, and I strained out the beans. I wasn't sure if I was going to use all the liquid or not, so I wanted to do it separately. I also added now the chicken meat that I had saved, and then went ahead and added all the beans to that. I seasoned that with some chili powder and some cumin. I ended up adding all of the broth, so that was about 4 cups of bean broth. And I stirred that up. What I forgot to show you here is that I also added about a 1/4 or a 1/3, somewhere in there, cup of salsa to that to give it just a little bit more of a bite. Then at that point I wanted to make some cornbread to go with this meal, and again I have a cornbread mix that is still in that same video that I mentioned previously, so I quickly made up a batch of cornbread. Now my soup was done. All the flavors had had time to meld together, and I added about a 1/4 cup of milk to that to kind of give it a creaminess to it. Cornbread was done, and it was time to serve dinner. I topped it with a little bit of cheddar cheese, salsa, and a dab of sour cream. We really enjoyed this meal a lot. Okay, you guys, there is my 5-day menu plan. Recipes are all below. It is super frugal, and again, it's cooking from scratch, and that's going to save you a whole lot of money in today's grocery prices. It's sorely needed. Ways to cook to save money. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, of course, don't forget to like and give me, a thumbs up, and subscribe if you like my content and you haven't subscribed yet. I would really appreciate that. All right, you guys, if you like this kind of video, don't worry, there will be more out in the coming weeks. I'm thinking of doing this as a series, so depending on what kind of feedback I get from it. Anyway, I hope you all have an amazing day today, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye-bye.